Okay, we are live. Tim? I'm gonna make you live now. It's already 2.
Yep.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Akshay Modi, and I'm a Manager Strategic Marketing at Zycus. I welcome you all to this Zycus-sponsored webinar held in association with the International Association for Contract and Commercial Management. Contract management. Many organizations struggle to define the return they will receive from increased investment in contract management. This makes it difficult to gain management support for increased resources or the underlying systems that could increase effectiveness. IACCM has undertaken extensive research to put numbers around the value of contract and commercial management. It has also explored the primary sources of value loss. In this webinar, IACCM and Zycus will focus on recent IACCM research with 50 of the world's top 200 corporation contract management strategies and tactics undertaken by them, such as investment in process and skills, improved access to tools and information, increased focus on the service delivery model, and the role of automation. We encourage you to actively participate in the webcast by asking questions and posting your comments or feedback. This webinar will be recorded. You will see a space to type questions as well as comments on the webcast window. So please do not wait till the end of the webinar for your questions and comments. Our speaker for the day is a subject matter expert with a rich experience in the contract management domain. On behalf of everyone, I welcome the speaker for today, Tim Cummins. Tim Cummins.
Hello there. Well, thank you very much, Akshay. And indeed, we're going to go on a journey today that looks at a number of the key initiatives that we're observing amongst many of the leaders in the corporate environment. And I suppose the encouraging news, to summarize part of our recent research studies, has been that indeed many of the contracts and commercial groups, both buy-side and sell-side, are gaining quite significant increases in management attention and investment. But of course, a consequence of that is that management is expecting considerably more from them. And so we are seeing some real pressures for refocusing and increasing the value of the delivery from contracts and legal groups. And we'll be touching a little bit today on some of the techniques and methods that they're deploying in response to those management demands. So I hope it's going to give you some interesting insights. It's going to give you, I suppose, an opportunity to benchmark a little bit in terms of, are the experiences we're sharing here consistent with the things that you're experiencing. And as Akshay said, in the Q&A session, we'll be happy, of course, to expand further on some of the summary detail that I'm talking about here. So if you have more in-depth questions about some of the approaches that we're going to be covering, we'll have a great opportunity to talk a little bit more about them. So let's just focus for a moment on aspects of background. And first of all, of course, this whole issue of compliance. It's important, I think, to start off by saying that, of course, compliance isn't a new issue. It really does lie at the heart of any successful business because it relates to the ability of that business to meet its commitments. The challenge today, in many ways, though, is that we have to be increasingly able to demonstrate our internal and external integrity. We have to be confident that we can ensure that suppliers perform, that internal staff and our third-party partners, routes to market, channels, etc., are operating in accordance with the rules and regulations, and that we keep our broader promises not only to our customers but also to our shareholders and society at large. So it's probably no great surprise to many on the call that the ACC, Association of Corporate Counsels, 2013 survey of Chief Legal Officers found that compliance, regulatory developments, and data and information security are right at the top of their list for the challenges of 2013. So clearly our discussion today is topical and timely. But if we look at this for a moment from the executive perspective, it's important to remember that simply achieving compliance is not, of course, going to generate the survival of our company. For the executive management, they're really looking for a capability to get a good balance between risk and opportunity. And if you read the media and listen to, of course, to the concerns of the CEO or the heads of marketing, many of the other executives, it is this question of, yes, we understand about the drivers for compliance. Yes, of course, we need to be compliant. We need to manage the risks associated with it, but we also need to manage that counter risk, that if we become too difficult, too slow, too risk averse, then of course we will lose market opportunity, and in the end of the day it is our ability to flourish in the market that is going to determine our future profitability and survival. So I think we're all sufficiently mature to understand that this is a tough balancing act. And one of the real questions for us as a community, whether you're listening to this as a lawyer or as a contracts professional or as a procurement professional, is what is the contribution we need to be making to achieving that balance between risk and opportunity. So before we get into that question and some of the techniques, let's just dwell for a moment on why it is that compliance has actually become such a big issue, because I think in thinking about and discussing briefly that background will help with some context for the ways that people are approaching it. Firstly, as I said, compliance is not new. It's become more severe. There are factors that have driven it to greater significance, but it isn't in itself new. So what is it that's driven it to becoming a bigger issue today? I think there are many factors, but possibly the one thing that sums it up particularly well is the one word, trust. There is a breakdown in trust. We have, of course, and I think many of you will be aware of the analyses that are undertaken of trust within society and the degree to which surveys continue to show that there is a general erosion of trust in most societies, that the confidence of people in whether it be government or in corporate behaviors or in the banking system or indeed even in the legal system continues to erode. And that, of course, is something that then drives counteraction, that if there isn't really trust, if there isn't a perception of integrity, then of course it tends to drive the momentum behind more and more regulation. So this erosion of trust and its continuation is an important issue. Now, why is trust eroding? Well, again, part of that is, of course, around globalization. It's around the breakdown of traditional societies. It's also about the breakdown in traditional trading relationships. Most of us are working with and dealing with people across different cultural systems, different value systems, to a far greater extent than we ever did before. Another factor is, of course, transparency. When there is wrongdoing of any sort, it becomes far more visible. The degree to which the public is made aware instantly through today's media and is able to have insight to corporate activities and corporate wrongdoing has, of course, been a significant factor in eroding confidence. And finally, there is the erosion of loyalty. And again, if we think about the degree to which our supply base has changed, the degree to which part of the buying habit today is to constantly threaten replacement of existing suppliers with new suppliers as a technique to try and drive down cost and prices, it's factors such as that which of course have then continued that erosion of trust. So I think another reason that there is such a big issue behind those factors is that if you think about many of the tools and systems that we use to oversee compliance, they haven't really adjusted to this new environment. And when it comes to contracts, I think everyone will agree that they are an important part of the compliance framework, but what exactly is their purpose in that? Today, they're primarily used to drive negative incentives. In other words, we try to battle over indemnities and liabilities and the consequences of failure. So there are negative incentives on performance, and in that sense, today's contracts really are adding to the problem, they're not solving it. Now, before we actually move then into the various factors that we're going to discuss, we'd be very interested in understanding which of the following do you anticipate in terms of disputes or issues is going to increase in the coming years? And as you can see, you have the choices here. Do you think that you're going to see a substantial increase in regulatory disputes or issues, competition or antitrust, in the volume of contract claims or disputes, intellectual property issues and claims and disputes, or issues around fraud? Be very interesting to know, and of course you can choose any or all of these, and our question is, do you think that these things are set to increase over the coming years? Now actually I'm of course not actually going to be able to show the answers from here, so perhaps we can come back to this at the end of the program just to share with the audience what their feelings and thoughts were, unless you would like of course to just give us a quick summary of what the answers seem to be.
Sure.
Okay, so we'll close off on that one. And if we look at the view of the external world, if we look at the legal function in particular, what are their expectations? And as I say, we can compare perhaps, and actually you may have some percentages for us. What you can see here is that in each of those fields, there are expectations from the legal community of generally significant increases. So everything sort of on the right-hand side, that 59%, for example, expect either slight or strong increases in regulatory issues and disputes, against only 7% who expect any significant decline. And as we go down this listing, you'll see the balance in virtually all of the categories until we get right to the bottom is of a continuing increase. So this may either be a reflection of lawyers being especially pessimistic, or it may of course be a reflection of the fact that they genuinely do think that we are likely to enter into ever more contention on some of these issues, which again of course explains why it is so high on that Chief Legal Officer list of concerns. So what are companies doing about it? As we did our studies, what were we finding that the leading corporations were really trying to do? Well, I think to start with, one very interesting area is the focus on greater empowerment through awareness. So we're seeing a growing focus by executive management on commercial and contracting competence rather than necessarily commercial and contracting organization. In other words, we are faced as a contract and legal community, buy side, sell side, doesn't matter which, with an expectation to do substantially more than we have in the past. Now, the good news is we're not necessarily being expected to do more with less. In fact, quite a number of organizations are having to do more with more. But it's a lot more with only a bit more. And part of then the challenge is, how do we actually empower the business to drive better judgment, better commercial and contracting awareness? And through that, we will obviously help reduce the growth of that volume of workload. We have to try and cut off many of these compliance and regulatory concerns right at the root, and that means a better informed sales force, a better informed business organization, better informed project managers. So we're seeing quite significant investment in trying to raise the commercial and contracting awareness and understanding of all of the people in the organization who touch customers and suppliers and therefore could create or control these exposures better. So that is one very important initiative, and I'll be interested in hearing later on whether that's one that you're experiencing. The second one that we're seeing was actually something that was forecast and identified in our 2012 study on the future of contracting, and that is much more focus on the things that matter. Now, one of the key ways in which that is manifesting itself is the growth of interest by many of the top law departments in trying to drive more in the way of industry standard terms and conditions. Most of us have gone through the drive internally of creating our own templates that we try and impose on the other side in the traditional battle of the forms. But many lawyers have recognized that that in itself is not efficient, it isn't sustainable, and often causes us to focus repetitively on things that are not really all that important. So we are seeing some very interesting initiatives coming from a number of industries, again, both buy-side and sell-side discussion, but more or less all of them coming out of the law departments that are turning to us and asking if we can help with the creation of some global standards that would actually reduce the frequency with which we need to negotiate many of these lower value, less important items. So can we build more in the way of some industry consensus and focus our negotiations and our discussions on the things that really have some value and make a difference? Again, we'll be asking, is that something you're perceiving within your company and industry? Third is the point of capturing the data for change. One of the challenges for all of us in the contracts and commercial space is that if we're not really abreast with what the market needs, or where perhaps our offerings, our terms, our policies and practices are failing to meet those needs, failing to make it easy to do business with our trading partners, then of course, if we have no visibility, we're not likely to get any better. So we're seeing, and this is, I suppose, part of the broader data mining and big data world and the growth of use of technology, more and more organizations like yours are trying to get into grips with what are the recurrent issues. We can't any longer afford to just handle each transaction in an isolated way. We have to actually start consolidating data more effectively to understand what are the things that happen on a regular basis. What are the issues that we finish up negotiating frequently? Are they avoidable? In what circumstances do they have value, and in what circumstances could we perhaps give ground or have fallback positions? So to what extent are we really capturing and understanding the areas where we need better knowledge, better data to stop wasting time on repetitive and low value activities? Let's understand better what are the things that typically go wrong, what are the underlying causes and sources for that. Let me give you an example. We were working with a company recently that had identified that a very high proportion of its invoices were going out incorrectly. Now traditionally, it may be that a contracts, commercial or legal group wouldn't even take an interest in that topic, they wouldn't even be aware of it. But as they became aware of it, rather than just dismiss it and just say, well, you know, that's a problem for finance or a problem for accounts payable or receivables, they recognized that maybe there were some underlying factors in the way of the contracting process that were causing those problems. And indeed, as they dug back into it, they realized that the way they were handling market demands for greater pricing flexibility had led to a level of complexity that the underlying business systems were not capable of managing. Now, obviously, that was having a whole series of negative impacts for the business. Not only did it mean substantial rework of most of the invoices, but of course customers were understandably annoyed by it. Customers were, customer trust was being further eroded because they felt they couldn't have confidence in the integrity of their supplier around invoicing process and pricing accuracy. And therefore it was damaging reputation, as well as then of course also causing delay in payments, and as a result damage to cash flow. Now those, it's a great example, I think, of where today's commercial and contracting groups have to think about compliance in a much wider way and have to start really capturing process-based data in order to drive improvement and allow, again, focus on areas of value rather than trying to correct mistakes. Again, we'll be asking you, to what extent are you seeing real drives in your organization around this focus on data for change? The fourth item I'd like to talk about briefly is that of the use of external resources to gather data. Many of us have looked at this compliance challenge, particularly when procurement or legal, as something where we maybe need to start doing far more due diligence. We need to put in some expensive and time-consuming methods of trying to undertake our own analysis. It is not only is this potentially very expensive in terms of the internal resource and system support that such a system would need, but it of course is also very, very time-consuming. And if we're going to do true due diligence, not only do we have to do it at the time that we enter into a relationship, but of course it's also an ongoing activity and an ongoing demand. It is clearly not affordable for most organizations to really build such a system. There are certainly ways that we can reduce the demand, for example, by going back to our point of understanding what really matters, making sure that we are thoughtful about the areas where we really must undertake the research. For example, if we're dealing with something like anti-bribery and corruption issues, we probably don't need to monitor every single trading partner. We clearly do need to focus our time and activity into the higher risk environments. So we have to become more sophisticated at doing internal analysis and segmentation of our relationships based upon the likelihood of risk around compliance issues. How likely is a compliance breach, but also what is the likely consequence of a compliance breach? It isn't a one-size-fits-all model. But even once we've done that analysis, we're often left with hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of people or organizations that we may need to be monitoring. So are there some shortcuts or other ways that we can do that? Well, again, big data is increasingly beginning to come to our rescue, and we do have to be thoughtful about the external resources that may be at our disposal to help us with that type of analysis. For example, most companies today would use an external financial ranking or rating agency such as Dun & Bradstreet in order to undertake or get financial data analysis back. Most of us have dispensed with having an army of accountants doing balance sheet analysis of suppliers to determine whether or not they're viable, or of customers in terms of whether or not they can pay. We rely upon an external resource to assist us. The same is beginning to emerge in areas such as broader compliance issues, whether it's around environmental issues, data protection breaches, breaches of anti-bribery and corruption laws, or indeed just the degree and frequency of lawsuits for perhaps disputes, contract disputes over performance. And the types of data agencies there vary. We have organizations like Achilles, for example, in the oil and gas sector, which are absolutely the standard now for that sector to actually look at many of these compliance issues. But we also have emerging organizations such as Briefcase Analytics, based out of Boston, where I happen to be today. Not with Briefcase, but physically in Boston, enjoying the snow. And Briefcase, for example, will undertake Dun & Bradstreet type analyses looking at a portfolio of these compliance issues and is able to give you very rapid reports in terms of a company's reported levels of performance and integrity. So think more broadly in terms of where data can come from and prepare for your future in that sense as well. The next point that I'd like to make is, of course, that of selecting the right partners. And whether we're buyers or sellers, we do need to be thoughtful about who we deal with. So what is right? Well, of course, that depends upon our value system. And one of the challenges, I think, particularly for procurement, is that recent years have driven to attitudes towards commoditization, attitudes of seeking the lowest price and being able to declare savings. Yet, of course, cheap suppliers will often be high on the list of those that may not have high levels of business integrity or reliability. And there is, I think, no doubt that there is sometimes a connection between cheap and low compliance levels. So we do have to really give some thought to that, and whether in fact it's our internal value and measurement systems that could be driving us to the wrong partners. But equally on the sell side of the house, we also need to be very conscious of the types of people we want to do business with and the dangers to our reputation. So for both sides of the house, I think this has become more and more part of the evaluation process. Are we putting the right things into our bid activity, for example? Does our RFX today ask the right questions to really get to grips with whether or not the partner we are engaging with is low risk or high risk when it comes to compliance? I'd also like to make what I think is a very important point here around the distinction between what I'm going to term the issues of integrity versus competence. Now, we do need to distinguish performance issues related to competence versus performance issues related to integrity. It is possible for us to address problems with competence of an organization, but if a party lacks integrity, we shouldn't be doing business with it. So our compliance system increasingly needs to identify and distinguish between organizations that lack integrity, i.e. they regularly fail to comply with their commitments because they don't feel like doing it, they regularly are in breach of things like environmental law, or they have problems around child labor or Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or whatever, versus organizations that struggle to actually perform because of certain competency issues. We can handle competency issues much more through traditional contracting measures. For example, the punishments that we have within our contract, our liabilities, indemnities, liquidated damages clauses, all of these can address and channel issues around competence, but they will not tackle issues of integrity. So we do need to be very careful, I think, in making sure we've distinguished between those in the selection of our partners. Again, we're going to ask you to what extent you think your organization is making that distinction and becoming more effective at selecting the right partner and including the right evaluation criteria within your RFP and your bid processes to really understand aspects of your partner's culture, their behavior, and the extent to which that is compatible with your value system and the reputation of your company and business. And finally, let's touch on the sixth item in our list, which is the question of honesty and trust. Now, let's just think about how we induce honesty and how we evaluate and drive issues of trust. And let's think about that for a moment in the way that we handle our contracts, because most contracts today do tend to be dependent very strongly on negative incentive. We frequently in our contracting processes and practices will do all that we can to pass risk to the other side. We believe that we can drive better behaviors through negative incentive. Now, if you think about that in the context of your personal relationships, I think you'll quickly see the point that that is, of course, a pretty naive and very constrained way of viewing the world. If, for example, within our families or personal relationships, the only way that we try to drive honesty and trust, for example, from our children, was through threats of dire punishment, we would actually often have the opposite effect. We would in fact cause our children typically to be dishonest because they want to avoid punishment. Of course, just the same thing happens in our business relationships. If the only approach we use is the stick, then what we tend to do is create levels of dishonesty, lack of transparency and openness, which then go, of course, add further to where we started with this conversation today. They undermine trust. So examples of that would be, of course, with things like liquidated damages clauses, where we are looking to impose penalties in a way that disincents people to come forward and admit to the fact there's a problem, whereas if they came forward early, we could often, in fact, overcome and address that problem. So one of the methods that we're seeing rapid growth in interest on is what we've termed here at IACCM relational contracting, looking at methods which actually encourage interaction and communication and create incentives for openness and honesty as opposed to disincentives. Another area that organizations are increasingly looking at is the whole question of measurement systems. Understanding what are the measurements that their trading partners use, and does that encourage honesty and integrity, for example, on the part of the sales force? Does it encourage more trustworthy and trusting behavior on the part of the procurement organization? So what are some of the measures that are used? But we equally need to understand those measures internally within our own business and the impacts they have upon the openness and honesty of communication even within our own business. Because in fact, if we have poor communications and poor commercial judgment going on within our business as a result of the lack of integrity and trust, then we will have very real compliance issues. I guess without wanting to pick on it further, the financial services industry is a case in point. If we look at the way that the bonus schemes and measurements were being driven, quite clearly there was a message that went out that said, you know, getting my bonuses and getting sales volumes, etc., is more important than the way I do it. And management seemed to be turning a blind eye to many of the underlying risks. And of course the consequence of it was that we see an industry that has really struggled to rebuild public and political trust because it has been shown up to be full of levels of dishonesty and a lack of overall trustworthiness. So these are very important issues. Compliance is, in the end, much more than developing rule books. It's a way of thinking and behaving because it's what you believe in. It's about issues of balance, of fairness, of honesty and ethics. And those issues very much work two ways. We cannot demand it of our counterparty, yet fail to exhibit it ourselves. So for the commercial and legal groups of today, this really has become quite a fundamental issue around understanding the elements that not only drive compliance, but which cause people to feel an interest in being compliant and in identifying and ensuring that the selections we're making are those that are consistent with our own internal compliance priorities and policies. So if we may, we're just going to ask you to give us a sense of the areas. We've picked the first 5 that I covered there, and we're very interested in understanding whether your organizations are actually embarked on any of the things that I'm talking about here. Are these things that you're either implementing or where you have active plans to implement in order to improve the quality of contracting competence and compliance within your organization? So let me just give you a moment to select any or all that you feel you are already in process of addressing. So while you look at those final points and comments from the poll, Akshay, and we'll move in a moment, of course, to any questions that you may have. So if you do have questions or comments, discussion points you'd like us to respond to, do please use that questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen under the control bar, and we will move on to those in just a moment. Otherwise, I think just to summarize what I've been talking about here, resilience in the face of these rapidly changing demands, and of course the changes around regulation and around these market forces are by no means at an end. We have to expect that they will continue. So being resilient in the face of these demands requires greater diversity. And by diversity, I think we're talking here about more and more inclusiveness. We have to be far better at identifying the range of stakeholders that are involved in commercial and contracting decisions, in trading relationships, and we need to make sure that they are included within our processes. Secondly, achieving high standards is going to depend on flexible rules. If we build highly rigid compliance systems, we're going to really struggle to keep up with the pace and nature of change that's going on around us. So again, that's why we've highlighted this importance of continuous evaluation based on business and market information, business and market intelligence, fueling and driving the decisions and the system and the process that we develop for compliance. And finally, it is of course critical that competence in this area is ultimately based on the ability to make good business judgments. And that, of course, takes us back to the very first comment that said we need to deploy this capability to make judgment far more widely across the organization through training, but also through access to information and systems, and through the continuous improvement and update of that information and those systems through the data capture we've been talking about. So all of these things tie together, and as we said right at the beginning, this was based upon an in-depth study of 50 of the global 200 corporations to find out just how they're approaching these contract, commercial and compliance delivery systems within their organizations, and this is the summary of some of those results. So Akshay, I think that probably gets us to our final sort of question set, but I don't know whether you're able to actually tell us anything or show us anything in terms of the survey polling results, because I suspect our audience may be interested in knowing what you discovered.
Thanks, Tim. This is a great discussion, and now we would like to spend some time on the questions which were posted by audience. Well, we have one question that is, Tim, this is there any evidence that top management is becoming more aware of the importance of contract management and more ready to make investments in it?
Yes, I think as I touched on at the beginning, Akshay, it's a good question. As I mentioned at the beginning, the encouraging news is yes, but of course they expect a return on the investment. So they're also looking for us to be more imaginative and creative in, if you like, squaring that circle that we mentioned at the beginning of how do we reconcile this need for greater compliance and more better management of risk with the need to also be more responsive to the opportunities out in the market with all the demands that they have for change and new commercial vehicles, new forms of contract and relationship. So they're looking for us to come at this with a level of creativity that I think traditionally hasn't been expected of all of the commercial and legal groups. And of course, if we don't respond to it, they certainly will be looking to others to do so. So yes to investment, yes to interest, but we do need to step up to that challenge and become much more capable of giving our executives much more informed opinions and advice around how to reconcile many of these challenges. One of the things we cannot do is slow down the business while we go through more rigorous compliance checking and activity. So again, all of these elements we talked about become important in that, including, of course, as you well know, and as is interesting to you, the need to deploy better technologies, not only to support information flows, to collect data and information, to assist analysis, but also, of course, to automate many of these controls and avoid the need for so much manual intervention. And let me just add, if, for those of the audience who may be interested in seeing a copy of the report that we're talking about, we'll certainly be happy to issue that to those who would like a copy.
Tim, there's another question as well. When you talk about selecting the right partners, can you give some idea of the sort of questions or criteria we should be looking for, and how are these best researched?
And I'm sorry, the second part of what that question was, and can you just read out the final few words again?
Yes, I'll repeat. When you talk about selecting the right partners, can you give some idea of the sort of questions or criteria we should be looking for, and how are these best researched?
Yeah. So the types of questions, interesting how we're beginning to see already some shifts in this. I think obviously organizations are becoming more mature in the way that they're evaluating their trading partners. And as I mentioned, it is both buy side and sell side that I think are beginning to address this. Let me give an example from the sell side. We've started to come across one of the things we've been advocating actually for a few years, but we are actually now beginning to see, for instance, questions in RFPs which directly ask suppliers to explain how they build commercial assurance or commercial competence in their organization. Very different sort of question. But they want to understand essentially as a supplier, do you have a system that really is reliable and is going to create integrity, if you like, in your offerings? On both buy side and sell side, we see an increasing interest in asking questions around, for example, ongoing governance systems and governance resources. If, for example, I make all these wonderful commitments, but I haven't actually invested in having any real post-award competence in delivery and oversight in my commitments, then how much can I really be trusted to deliver them? In addition to which, it's likely to be very expensive, and there's a much higher probability that our relationship will go bad, that we will in fact get into contention and dispute. And again, our research clearly shows a connection between the quality of the contract management disciplines and resources and process and the likelihood of a successful project or trading outcome. So those, I think, are examples certainly of the types of questions. We're also seeing companies, again buyers, more looking for case study examples of where their suppliers have perhaps had very similar types of projects or activities and to explain and describe the way that they have approached that in order to get a demonstration of their likelihood to be a collaborative partner as opposed to an adversarial or nickel and diming partner. So I think these are all very important initiatives, and of course again they reflect this broader drive towards the need for better and more investment in the commercial and contracting process. And again, I emphasize the point, it's the process that we need to improve. A byproduct of that may well, of course, be some shifts in the role and significance of the commercial or contracts or legal function, but that isn't our start point. Where we must begin with this, Akshay, is very much in the question of how do we build a good, robust process, and then how do we populate it with the right skills and knowledge.
Very well said, Tim. There's another question which, we got from an audience. We work a lot with overseas companies that doesn't seem to understand compliance. How should we handle that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because of course we are talking here, unfortunately, about, there are very real cultural divides, and we shouldn't pretend there aren't. We clearly see very real differences in terms of the extent of regulatory imposition, so we have obviously some countries, the US particularly, I suppose, that seems to be gung-ho on bringing in more and more regulation, and the estimates of the cost of that are phenomenal in terms of the impact and imposition that places on business. Indeed, there are many who are concerned about, of course, the competitive impact that has on the costs of doing business and the competitive advantage it potentially gives to countries that don't have that regulatory burden. But, we also run, of course, into some very real cultural divides here in that, for example, there are clearly countries out there still that do have much, perhaps, cozier relationships, which are often built around levels of back scratching, which we would probably term to be corrupt. We obviously have different perceptions and perspectives on the morality or otherwise of environmental issues, of child labor issues, etc. The truth is, Akshay, at the end of the day, obviously, compliance or failure to comply carries an increasing cost. And one does wonder sometimes cynically whether there are executives who make a calculated assessment that says, well, what is the relative cost of being caught for non-compliance? If I can make $2 billion or save $1 billion or whatever it might be through practices that are not compliant, but the scale of my fine is only going to be $200 million, then, maybe it's a risk worth taking. Because in truth, how much does the market really punish me for a non-compliance issue? And although there does appear to be a temporary impact on share prices when people are found are charged with major non-compliance issues, it does seem often to be quite temporary. So I think the reality of this discussion is one where you certainly need to be very aware of the impacts of compliance issues. And I think what is turning it around here in the Western world is, of course, the fact that there are many situations now where senior executives personally face the possibility of imprisonment. And that has really focused minds, and I don't think any longer many people would view compliance as optional. So it means that, as I mentioned, you need to come up with I think, an effective and segmented approach to compliance. You need to increasingly have the intelligent discussions within your business and with executives that tell them, well, there are certainly going to be cheaper options. We can maximize savings, but it is at a higher level of risk. And executives have to be directly involved in that balancing decision. And you shouldn't be nervous, I believe, in having that conversation with your executives. Indeed, I think it is absolutely important. It's part of that strategic engagement, if you like, that we need to have with them. There are conscious trade-offs. You need to become more mature at understanding the nature of those trade-offs. For example, we're running another webinar shortly on the whole anti-bribery and corruption area with some thoughts and suggestions on how you might undertake segmentation within that program to better recognize levels of riskiness so that you have a program that is geared to the levels of probability of bad things occurring. But you also need to look at trying to improve some of the standards around, for example, your compliance terms and conditions. Have you developed good internal standards? Have you created internal understanding, for example, amongst your vendor managers of how those terms should be overseen and policed? Have you worked, and are you looking to work more cooperatively within your industry, perhaps, to drive to better standards? We're working, for example, with financial services industry around compliance issues associated with their outsourcing relationships. So I think all of these types of things are going to lead to this growth of sophistication and our ability to improve the insights we get and the judgments we make in determining our foreign trading partners. Part of this, and again our webinar and FCPA will talk about this more, part of this is going to also lead us to the need to invest sometimes in working with our trading partners for education programs and actually partnering with them to ensure that there is training that's going on. So one option, obviously, with a more sophisticated partner is that you look for them to confirm on a regular basis that internal training is occurring, but there will be other partners where strategically, if you want to work with them, where perhaps you'll need to support and assist them and actually send in or provide them with relevant training and ensure that there is understanding within their organization of why compliance and why these issues of ethics and behavioral matter.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for the for your insight. But this was a great discussion, and we would like to thank Tim for sharing his experience and insight with all of us. We also thank our audience for their time and questions, which make the webinar especially interesting. You can see the contact information for any questions, query. You can note down our email addresses. The archive link for this webinar would also be available at our website, that is www.zycus.com. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Akshay, and goodbye. Thanks again to, as you say, to the audience for their participation and ideas and questions. So, bye for now.
Thank you. Bye. Tim? Tim?